Do you know how to engage your stakeholders for the double materiality assessment? In this interview, I'm going to talk to Anika from Greenativity, and she's going to tell us how to choose the right stakeholders and how to choose the right method to then interact with those stakeholders. If this interests you, definitely check out this episode. Hey, Anika. And first of all, thank you so much for taking the time. The two of us, we already know each other, but for those listeners that don't know you yet, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What are you doing and why are you here?
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm Anika. I'm originally German, as you can hear. Sustainability consultant at different consultancies, but also at Greenativity. We are strategy consulting and sustainability, and basically focused on double materiality assessment, strategy development, and reporting according to CSRD. Yeah, and I'm here because you invited me to talk a little bit about double materiality assessment and going a bit more into detail when it comes to methodology and process based.
Perfect. Yeah. I also have some more specific questions I want to ask you later about the stakeholder engagement. But before we dive into the topic, you already mentioned the DMA, the double materiality assessment. Can you tell us what is this topic about? And for those listeners that are maybe not familiar with it, just like a little bit of an introduction so that we are all on the same page.
Yeah, sure. So basically, double materiality assessment is part of the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, mouthful. And it basically is two perspectives that you look at a company's sustainability topics. And one is the impact perspective. So, what's the impact on the environment and society by the company? And on the other hand, it's on a financial perspective, which is basically the environmental factors on the financials of the company. And the double materiality assessment doesn't dictate, or the ESRS, CSRD doesn't dictate a certain process. But usually we use one process that covers stakeholder mapping, so selecting affected stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
then creating a long topic list based on different factors, shorten the topic list, prioritize the list, then running your stakeholders through an assessment, and then basically building a materiality matrix and finding out what are your material topics from either impact perspective, financial perspective, or both perspectives.
Okay. And in the process that you just mentioned, can you explain a little bit more? How do I know as a company, like who are my stakeholders? Who do I need to talk to? I can imagine that sometimes, especially if there are large value chains, there might be a lot of potential stakeholders there. So how can one go about this topic?
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, you do a stakeholder mapping. That means you look at both perspectives, the financial and the impact perspective. And then you have certain stakeholder groups that you look at. And that these are different for financial and impact perspective. To give you an idea for the financial perspective, these are experts in the finances that can estimate what the financial impact on the company is
Hmm.
for its investors or your finance department, external, internal. For the impact perspective, it's more people or stakeholder groups that know about the environmental impact, the social impact, and the governance impact. So you really want to get the right stakeholders at a table to understand like where are your impacts and what's your financial materiality. And for this, you really need to narrow it down. And usually you create a stakeholder group list. And then you attach stakeholders to each stakeholder group that you can use or include into your assessment part.
Okay. And in your experience working with companies, is this an easy task or where are companies struggling? Because I can, yeah, like when you tell it, it sounds straightforward, but then I'm not sure if all the companies already know like how to assess their stakeholders.
So usually you have like a template list in like for each industry, what could be potential stakeholders for that
Mhm.
potential particular industry. And we work ourselves down, but then you really need to think of who are your affected stakeholders. So who could really tell you something about that particular topic and who is maybe an expert in that topic. So you really, because I've seen also double materiality assessments where you ask like hundreds of people,
Mhm.
but they are not necessarily the affected stakeholders. So you maybe have done your due diligence when it comes to quantitative assessment, but you maybe didn't get the right people on the table to assess it. And when I talk about the table, it's
Mhm.
not that you have to do a workshop and get them all together in one room, but you definitely want to have certain stakeholders that you involve in your assessment.
Mhm.
And therefore, there's the different methodologies you can use. So I think stakeholder mapping comes first, really having your stakeholder groups, attach stakeholders to the groups from both perspectives. And then you can identify, hey, what methodology works best, considering company size, considering stakeholders, and considering also the complexity of the supply chain and this.
Yeah. I think this would have been my next question. So let's assume I know my stakeholders and I know who to talk to. How do I then talk to them? Like, what is the next step? You already slightly introduced the methodology. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So what we always do is we really identify what methodology works best with every company. So there's for us not just one rule of thumb, but for instance, if you have a really large company, you maybe want to have a quantitative assessment where you invite more stakeholder groups and stakeholders, or you maybe want to and you want to validate it with qualitative assessment. So you later go into the more qualitative workshops, for instance. When there's a smaller company, then a quantitative assessment really doesn't make sense. Only if they affect many, many, many stakeholders, yeah,
Mhm.
that you maybe want to have a representation of them. But usually we would say, um, let's say, really in a workshop environment for each perspective and run through the topics. In general, what we recommend is also splitting the topics in environment, maybe social governance together, or even split up. So you don't overwhelm your stakeholders while you're doing the workshops. Um, and in general, yeah.
Okay. And how can you tell whether you go with a quantitative approach or qualitative approach? Like
Mhm.
you already said that it's basically based on how many stakeholders I talk to, but are there specific numbers, or is this more of a gut feeling, or is this situation based?
Well, it's not a gut feeling, but you really need to check on how many stakeholder groups do you have and how many stakeholders are attached and how can you get their assessment. So, and how much knowledge is already there within the base that you do the assessment. And so I would always say we always tailor to each company,
Hmm.
but we always recommend also to have a qualitative validation somehow, because even though what we could see a lot is that in the impact analysis versus financial analysis, impact is always rated a little bit lower.
Hmm.
So and I don't know, it's probably the bias of people, um, or different biases actually, that make them rate lower. So you should always consider having this information validated then with qualitative assessment. As said, I wouldn't say there's a rule of thumb for quant or qual, but when it's a small company, I would just go for workshops and expert interviews, for instance. When it's getting bigger, I would do a quantitative and validate it with a qualitative. And also considering for financial analysis, is a quantitative actually necessary, or is there just a small number of stakeholder groups that you need to engage? So maybe you don't even do the quantitative part. To be honest, we often just do the qualitative part from financial perspectives.
Okay.
Does it make sense? Also, when we talk about qual and quant, it's
Hmm.
sometimes, even though we do workshops, what we do with our stakeholders, we still rate the topic together.
Hmm.
Simply because we want to later have also the metrics where we can position the topics. So I don't want to be misleading here with qualitative, quantitative, because it's more like workshops versus survey, maybe
Yeah.
like that.
So maybe to just play devil's advocate for a second, what would you say if I, as a company, I decided for me it's much easier to just use a quantitative approach and I just send out a bunch of surveys to all my stakeholders? Um, why is this not a viable option? Because you just talked about like a balanced approach with quantitative, qualitative. Why can I not just
Mm.
save time, send out the same survey, send it to everyone, and hope for the
Yeah,
best?
because simply you need to you need to be very, very diligent before with your stakeholder selection. And also, you need to make sure that it's really just limited to that selection, because what we see a lot is open surveys that anyone can access,
Hmm.
which is a little bit difficult then, because you will get just input from many people, but not
Hmm.
from the right people. And I think if you just do quantitative, and I really wouldn't recommend it, because you also want to do afterwards the validation with the leadership team, with the core sustainability team, maybe with experts, to be really sure that the topics that were just voted on are actually your material topics. Yeah. Um, I'm sure maybe in the first year there are some companies that just do it for the sake of testing it out. But
Hmm.
I would always recommend to still validate it with sitting together, running through the topics, through the results, really considering expert input here, um, and never just keep it internally.
Hmm.
Also, that's maybe one very important suggestion, because it's like otherwise your stakeholders internally say, "Oh yeah, that's a topic. Yeah, nah, that's not too much of a topic." So you really want to have the selection right in the beginning. So you also have external input.
Hmm.
Um, and we experienced a lot of, like, especially in expert interviews, so in one-on-ones, you get a lot of input on certain topics that you wouldn't have had just with the core team. Yeah.
Now, so it makes all a lot of sense, and I'm just trying to like completely understand the theory. But could I generally then say that the qualitative approach is always better than the quantitative, and it just depends on whether I have enough time for this, or is this also then oversimplifying from my side? Um,
Uh-huh. Um, so before just doing quantitative, I would rather do qualitative
mhm,
for sure. Um, and but you can involve the rating in the workshops, for instance. And as I said, it's so important that you have the right people, the affected stakeholders that are in the assessment. Um, that's the case, and they really represent all of the stakeholder groups that you've selected. I think that it should be fine. Um, it's more about how to get to your result. And I think you get better to your result when you have a qualitative, but then you need to sometimes do it in an extensive way, because you have interviews, maybe you have a workshop. You can't have like 10, 20 people in a workshop because you will have 10, 20 opinions. And so it is a bit more difficult, especially in really big companies. I suggest to also do the quantitative part. Um, but as said, from the finance perspective, I think qualitative is often enough. Yeah.
yeah. You just now, or in the whole podcast, mentioned a lot of different terms of like qualitative approach, quantitative with interviews, and all of this. And I also get asked often about materials so that people can like sit down and read something. Do you have any where you have written down all the different elements you just mentioned, or something like a guide that can maybe help people to not just listen to that, but then also have something in front of them that is a little bit more visual?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, sure. So on the website greenativity.de or .de/en, you can find a free guide on double materiality assessment and CSRD. That gives you like a top level information on what we just talked about, and especially about the process from selecting affected stakeholders to later on building a methodology for your assessment. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Could you send me the links afterwards? Then I
Yeah.
can put them into the show notes. Okay.
Yeah.
I have one last question I would like to ask you. So let's say someone listened to all of our conversation and they have a meeting within their double materiality team next week. What is the one thing that they should remember and maybe take to that conversation so that they can make sure to select the right stakeholders and select the right methods?
Mhm. Yeah, I think one thing is really do the stakeholder mapping at an early stage. Even though it's not like you're not obliged to do it, to do the mapping, I think it really helps you to identify how to best do your assessment. And I think then really tailor it to your company and to the stakeholder groups that you selected. So you really want to get to your material topics and not just do your ticking off boxes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that sounds super helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope that we can talk very soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Daniel.
Hey, if you come this far, thank you very much for listening to the AtlasZero podcast. If you're interested in this topic, we just launched the AtlasZero Navigator, which is basically a product compiled of all the interviews we ever done, all the materials we either created or collected, comprised into one product. It basically helps you to understand all the sustainability reporting requirements of the EU, and we really think it's super helpful. So if you're interested, definitely check out the link below and check out our product. And also, and I have to ask this, please like and subscribe to our channel. Like, it helps us a ton to reach more people. And at the end, our goal is to help as many companies as possible. So you can help us a little bit in achieving that. Thank you very much. And I hope I see you very soon.